much, Jamie, and thank you all. The very thought of having a cultural panel and people have fled this particular venue for other greener pastures, but we must entertain them. Very quickly, just to introduce this wonderful group of people who we put together, literally from the neighborhood. Matt Reed, who was formerly the CEO of the Aga Khan Foundation in India. He presently heads up the Aga Khan Foundation's works here in the United Kingdom. And very soon, 2 weeks from now perhaps, just down the road, there's going to be this incredible new architectural wonder that's going to be opened here in London, and many seven-stepped garden office space, which shows you 7 different kinds of Islamic garden formations. So you all must go and see that. So thank you so much, Matt, for being here. Suhair Khan is with the Google Cultural Lab, and that's something that Google launched. And for many of you who are in the cultural space, you all will know that if you need to look at a museum, you need to find out some information of anything to do in that broad, large cultural field, all you need to do is log on to Google, and rather than going and visiting a museum, you can actually get all the information from Suhair. So Suhair, thank you very much for being here. On my right is Lady Kishwar Desai. Kishwar and I sort of go back a long time. We started in television together in the year dot. I'm 32, I don't know about her. And though we still have, both of us have the right sort of length of hair. Kishwar then went on in more recent times to set up what has become one of India's first brick and mortar museums of memories. And she set up the Partition Museum to record so many of the lost stories of what happened in and around partition, both good and bad and ugly, but very important record that history. And this is in Amritsar. It's been gaining traction year on year, month on month. It's still very much a project in process. It's not completely finished, but we hope that with more funds coming in, Kishwar is going to be able to create something that's much needed in India. So thank you, Kishwar. She's also an author. Her new book has just come out or about to come out?
About to come out.
About to come out, and she's won a numerous prizes, and hopefully you'll get to see her books up in the library. Roly Keating, as Jamie said, is the CEO of the British Library since 2012, if my memory is not mistaken. He's really created this incredible hub of activities here, and I think a few years ago in 2015, he launched what was the vision of the future of the British Library, a whole learning and digital program, so to speak. I'm going to start with you, Roly. Thank you so much. Thank you for the British Library for being the home to JLF here in the UK. And for us, in many ways, we really find an incredible synergy with your audiences, with many of your colleagues, and of course, all these wonderful books that sit behind us in your library. But I just wanted to start with, institutions, Matt, the museum, Google, and you in many ways, you're the sort of, in a sense, the vessel in which all of this collective knowledge sits. And in the telling of people's stories and the telling of the histories, so many numerous people, historians, novelists, journalists, sort of come to your library to research what is obviously an incredible plethora of information that you've been able to put together. But in that researching, they then interpret it in a way that tells that story, perhaps in a new way, perhaps in a different way. In your mind, is there a problem in the retelling of histories and in the reinterpretation of histories and information, especially when there's documentary evidence that sits here in your library?
Well, I think, no, I don't think it's a problem. I think we're sitting in the midst of the biggest opportunity, not the biggest problem. Really interesting to reflect on those themes, Sandra, and just to say how fantastic we feel at home having you here, by the way. I think, to set the scene, I think there is a story here, maybe over the last 20, 30 years, around big institutions, partly about opening up and partly about exactly this theme of narrative and stories and enabling stories. Maybe not always telling them, but helping people find stories, create stories, tell counter stories. But it has been a journey, and I think when the British Library was conceived and created after the war, it was probably seen as a largely academic, scientific endeavor, and quite enclosed to a degree. Otherwise, it's a story of opening up. And sure, still, I mean, you've mentioned the collections, and that custodian mission still sits at the heart. It'll always be at the heart of what we do. It was there in the British Museum collection 200 years ago. We think 200 years ahead. This building was specified to last at least 250 years. I hope it'll last longer. And just to correct you a little bit, there are some books behind us, but actually they're mostly below us. No. As those of you who know the British Library, this is not a piazza, it's a roof. And it is below you. I was down there 2 days ago looking up and thinking about all this stuff. But below us are 4 stories, deep stories of memory, heritage, publications, available. And if you come into a reading room, you can ask for any of them and they'll come out. So that, I guess, is why the building was built with, wonderful as it is, as welcome as it is, built with sturdy railings and is a little bit of a fortress. But really, what has happened organically, and then, yes, we accelerated it when we published our Living Knowledge vision, is about the opening up of that to different audiences, different ideas, and really thinking about the other purposes of institutions. For research, certainly of all kinds, for business and industry, for cultural audiences, for young people of all ages trying to learn, for international audiences, and in an organic way, I think there's something about the magnetism of simply knowing that any kind of knowledge is here that gradually welcomes people to come and find their stories in it. And I'm sure we'll come back to the digital theme, but just to conclude by saying that I think what we have noticed in the last 10 years is that the more screen-based people's lives have become, the longer the queues seem to be in front of our front door every day. So some strange synergy, which I don't fully understand, is beginning to happen, but it certainly means they don't seem to be just going to Google and that replacing the institution. Somehow they're feeding into each other.
I'm going to come back to, what really has been one of the most wonderful things is to come in early in the morning, and we come in before all of you come in, and you come in and you see a vast line, irrespective of the day that it is of the week, of people lining up wanting to access the library. And I'm going to come back to you as to how do you work that particular magic. But coming to you, Suhair, the previous session, and I don't know if any of you were at the previous session where they talked about Subhash Chandra Bose's plane accident, and in this new book that puts together all 7 of the theories of the plane accident, of the evidence that was involved in the plane accident, which was 5 people who were eyewitnesses in the plane when the accident happened, 1 person who was outside the plane on the tarmac seeing the plane crash, and then the 3 people, the 3 doctors who treated Subhash Chandra Bose. And yet, even 70 years after that, there's this continuing sort of question about, is he alive, is he a sadhu, and is he grown 2 feet taller, etc. Right. So when it comes to Google, today you can actually go online and you can check all of these facts. But in checking the facts, yet again, I ask you the same question. People still tend to make fiction out of the facts that you have, in store. And is there, in today's world where, the whole fight or the discussion around fake news, or where facts are being, in a way, adapted to a telling of new version of a story. How do you all sort of deal with that? Are you just a vessel from which this has to be extracted, or are you a curated vessel?
Well, the reason the Cultural Institute was originally founded was to give voice to institutions that are custodians of cultural content, whether it's art, whether it's history, whether it's archives. We've done fashion, natural history. So we really saw it as an opportunity to give a voice to a global audience, to institutions that in many cases have millions of visitors a year, like the British Library, but in others are, in remote countries and regions where people don't have physical access and don't have that voice. So for us, what was really important is creating a platform where you had curators at museums able to write stories around their collections, or the actual artifacts in their museums, putting in all of the metadata that you would have in a museum around the age of an object and where it came from and who owned it. And that's their opinion and that's their story to tell. We have a lot of projects which are curated, which are thematic. So we did a project on fashion last year. We have one on Monday launching around the suffragettes. And that's with 23 institutions around the UK. Each of them will have their own perspective on this story. But because they're cultural institutions, because they have access but also have been given ownership of these collections and are responsible for it, we have given them the voice to tell the stories of it. And that is why this platform was originally founded, is not to have a vast internet with paintings that you'd have to search for and find sort of blurry or with watermarks, but allow the best quality, the best resolution image to be online with complete data and to let people see for themselves what culture is, whether it's in England or in America or in Cuba or in Egypt or of course in India, and that was really the goal of it.
And whose interpretation is that? I mean, when you look at any of the museums, etc., whose voice are you actually showing as the expert of that particular?
In most cases, it is the curator. So with the British Library, we last had their curator of medieval history and manuscripts tell us amazing stories about the history of magic and myth. All the way from sort of medieval history down to Harry Potter and the Sorcerer's Stone today. So it is the voice of whoever the museum appoints to be in charge of telling their stories.
Kishwar, why is it important to keep our stories alive and keep these memories and record them?
Well, good question. But before that, I really want to thank you and, of course, the British Library, because we've worked with both of you to set up the museum as it exists today. And also a small correction there, Sanjoy, the museum is actually complete. It started, the journey was over a period of about 2.5 years. We had a deadline in mind that on the 17th of August, which we requested the Punjab government in India to declare as Partition Remembrance Day, because that was the day when the Radcliffe Award was actually announced 2 days after independence, that the real mayhem broke out. And so the museum was dedicated to that, about a people on both sides of the border who did not know that tomorrow they would have to choose a country, the next day they didn't know which country they belonged to, and they had to leave their homes. Very often, all their possessions, lost a lot of people. So the point was, Sanjoy, that when we began, we actually, unlike because Ronnie, you were lucky. You began with a collection. Sure. When we began the museum, we had no collection, we had no money, we had no office, we had nothing. We just had this dream, and that is simply 2.5 years ago. So I also want to talk about the power of the people. When people decide that this is a memory, as you said, why do I think it's important? No, I think people, the way they responded, and they told us that this is important. And that is why we set up the museum, because we did a couple of open sessions with various people, because I had been, including talking to my dear friend Sanjoy and others, been terrified into sort of at times, oh my God, what is going to happen? Why are you doing this? And this is crazy and so on. But all the sessions we did with just ordinary people like me, we just sat around and we said, should this museum be done? We did it here in India. We did it in India, we did it here in London, and we also very quietly also approached our friends in Pakistan and said that, do you think this kind of thing should come up? And in Bangladesh as well, and everywhere, anyone we spoke to said this is important. You need to preserve these memories, because all our parents, our grandparents, they're fast fading away. Most of them who were witnesses to the partition are now gone. It is now the people who were children at that time, who were 17, 18, 21, maybe young adults, they're the only ones who are left with us, because after all, it's 70 years. So I think coming from a country where it's not just memory, we also don't preserve, and we have this long history of not preserving our history properly. Even our documents are not looked after. We know we have some pretty shambolic museums which had been running for years, which are now being hopefully revamped. So I think this was very important for us as a people, as a nation, and all the nations involved, including the UK, to tell this story, to grab hold of our narrative, because what had happened so far, it had been told, yes, by historians, but what was actually happening? So we were talking about Gandhi, Nehru, Jinnah, Mountbatten, and that was the level, the high level at which the story was being told. But what about my family? What about somebody else's family? I mean, their stories, and they're the people who really suffered through the partition, and their story was completely missing. All you heard about was the massacres. So in the museum, we do memories, but the memories are not just about the massacres. The memories are also about what was before partition. And because in order to understand why a couple divorced, you first have to understand what was the life before, and maybe they were very happily married, and that is exactly what turned out to be the case, how they all lived together in great harmony, and how they long for it. So the museum was originally called the Museum of Love, Loss, and Longing, because that's what we found, that is how people were reacting the more deeper we went into it. And the last gallery is a gallery of hope, where we have a lot of memories, recent memories, of people, of young people also, who go back to their family homes and record, and the warmth and the love and affection they felt. So this is, and then we also have galleries of divisions, where we talk about how everything was divided. Again, it's told through memories, how the border was created, how the army was divided, how the police was divided, how the museums were divided, you know, like the Mohenjo-daro, the famous necklace where 3 beads go to India, 5 beads go here, you know, stuff like that. So basically, the memories come at all levels. They're not just family memories, but they're also memories about what actually happened, you know, happened to institutions, happened when they were in refugee camps, what was the experience at that time, how did people, actually there are also a lot of memories of resilience, of how their families overcame that, and now some of them are leaders, they're nationally known and internationally known people. So memories came at different levels, but yes, it was very important for our historical narrative. It remained incomplete, I felt, and so did everybody else who helped us with the museum, including you now, I think, Sanjoy. So now it has 14 galleries. Do visit it. It's
But Kishwar, tell me, what's the reason? You've done this as an individual. I mean, you and Meghna, they've literally knocked on every door to make this museum come to life.
Shameless.
Is there a responsibility of government in this creating of memory? I mean, you created the Gandhi statue here at Parliament Square as well, which you put a lot of your energy and effort into. Do governments have responsibilities to have spaces like this where knowledge and information and memories rest?
I now have strongly come to believe that the government's only responsibility in this is to create those spaces. But they should also create funds that people can then look for help and source them when required. But as far as the historical narrative is concerned, the government should not interfere. I think the cultural art and cultural stuff should be left to the people, because there is a passion, there is a certain spontaneity and a certain kind of authenticity to what people can do than what governments can do. So I do believe it is their responsibility to some level. Like, we got no help, except we did get the space from the Punjab government.
On rent.
But yeah, well, no, they gave it to us for a few years.
On lease.
On lease.
On lease.
And you know, so I think there is a way forward. We can move forward in that sense, because we need to take the narrative back, I think, in certain cases, yeah.
Matt, you know, talking about individual actions, you know, the Aga Khan Foundation, and driven by the Aga Khan and the family, has really, over decades, has created this incredible amount of work in heritage and preservation, in trying to look at cultures differently, but doing so that it becomes accessible, not necessarily for one sect or a lot of people, but really make it accessible to all kinds of people to be able to share a particular form of Islam. Can you tell us a little bit first about what has motivated the Aga Khan and their philosophy in making it so accessible? And also, why then, whether it's the restoration of the Humayun's tomb or the gardens there, or recreating or creating the garden in Cairo from the rubbish yard, or even the new building that you've got, what's the purpose of making this possible and giving it to the people? And what do you aim to achieve in a world where divisions seem to be, and the building of walls to be able to contain communities are becoming much more important for many such people.
Absolutely. Well, I mean, I think it's precisely your latter point that makes all of this seem much more urgent to us now, and it's something that I think His Highness the Aga Khan has felt an urgency about for many, many years. My understanding is that, so His Highness is celebrating 60 years as the Imam of the Ismaili Muslims this year. My understanding is that when he was named Imam 60 years ago, I think he was 20 years old, he was quite young, and of course he went on a tour of the world to visit his community. His community is a diaspora community. They have always lived in dialogue with multiple traditions and faiths, so not only multiple traditions of Islam, but also others in and around where they live. And he was struck, is my understanding, by the diversity of what is called the Ummah, so the wider Islamic world, but also the decay, frankly, of a lot of these historic sites, a lot of the memory of those sites, these really important places, and was dismayed by that, and wanted to, because his view is that those sites are important sources of pride, of identity, but also that these places, these sort of lieux de mémoire, as Pierre Nora says, these places of memory, are also places where you can interrogate the past. You can learn about this pluralism. So fast forward then to our organizations now. So we're a collection of 10 development agencies. We work in economic development, social development, education, health, et cetera, and cultural development. We're one of the only organizations in the world that I'm aware of that works on all three. And the reason that we work on all three, and especially the reason why we focus on culture, is that His Highness believes that, well, let me back up. Across all of them, we want to do three things. We want to improve the quality of life. We want to enhance people's self-reliance, their ability to have a voice in their own affairs, to sort of take charge of their own development. And then the third thing is to promote pluralism, promote that appreciation of other cultures and that engagement of individuals. So our engagement in culture is about precisely that. First of all, restoring historic cities, preserving lost traditions or traditions that are in the process of being lost, as a way of providing us a platform to interrogate those pasts and to learn about those histories, some of which are contested. It doesn't mean that everybody is going to agree. The whole point exactly is that you want to preserve these spaces for dialogue. And then the other thing that's important for us about culture is that they be living places. These are assets for development in the same way that oil is an asset or other natural resources are an asset. Culture can be an asset for development. It can be a source of livelihood. It can be a source not only of pride, but of living. And so all of our programs are integrated in making these living places. And that translates whether it's to the work around the Al-Azhar Park where we're engaging, there's a sort of slum area right next door, and the point being is that the residents in that neighborhood have been involved in the restoration work. We've trained them so they now have trades that not only did they work on the restoration itself, but now these artisans have created their own businesses and are sort of doing their own thing. That involvement of local communities in culture is something that we find fundamental so that they're also invested in it.
So here, I was in the Andaman Islands this winter, and in Havelock, which is at the end of the world, absolutely stunning. I came in a shop. I came across a sign which said, Lord Macaulay, after he had traveled through the length and breadth of India, comes back to Parliament here, and he makes a statement, and he says, I've traveled through India, and I haven't met a poor person. It is a land of great riches. And unlike Africa, where we've been able to subjugate its people by power of the sword, in a sense, the only way to subjugate the Indian people, if at all, is to do so through culture and through education, and to show that we are a superior culture and a superior language. So Suhair, is that Google's strategy of taking over the world?
I think
Sorry,
I
sorry
think
for
it's
throwing you into that
It's a
one.
great question.
I know where that one was going.
Nice lead up. I think that the point of what we do is really, and it's really hard to emphasize, we work with right now 2,000 cultural institutions in 70 countries and growing. We just launched our first museum in Kenya. And really the goal is to really go beyond a perception of what a country is and to say, actually, you can open it up and you can peer inside. No one should ever not go to a museum if they can. No one should ever not go to the Andaman Islands or to Nairobi or wherever else if they have the opportunity to do so. But we are trying to give people the opportunity to access by providing support in terms of digitization. You can wander around the streets of Lahore using Google Street View. You can visit all of the sites of the Archaeological Survey of India online, and you can help to open up your world and hopefully form your own opinion. I think the fact that everybody now does have access to the internet, to technology, to a smartphone, means that there's always going to be a lot of power and a lot of responsibility. And that is why I think, because there are resources now in many large private organizations to support, the step of taking the hand of a curator in a museum and saying, here's a platform, here is our technology to support you. If you think that it might showcase to a new audience your story, if we can translate into 10 new languages the exhibition that you curated, or if we can bring you to a country where you may never have an audience at all, let us offer you that opportunity in your words. And I think we're in a challenging position because we do represent a very big company, but I should add that we only work with not-for-profits and we don't monetize this particular platform at all. And yet, of course, we understand what people's perceptions are, and we really hope that the voices of the museums and cultural institutions will really speak for themselves.
Roly, is Google a challenge for the future of libraries and the way libraries have been seen to be sort of receptacles of knowledge and information in a very different way?
In a different way. I mean, I think I've no, in my view, and I mean, I've got into trouble before by saying that libraries predated the internet and I think will outlast it, precisely because they take such a long view, and the values and principles of free access to knowledge by any means for everyone, if necessary and wonderfully at its best on site with physical content, is a very ancient idea which I think will be a very, very future-facing idea as well. And on that journey, we work with partners, and Google is one. And just to really, show, to develop what Suhair was saying, I think all of us are aware of the power, of course, of companies like yours. And with great power comes great responsibility. And I think all the digital giants feel that. And in different ways, you're all holding yourselves to account, and we're holding you to account. But I have to say, in terms of the Cultural Institute, just to pay tribute, I think the respect that you and your team show for the institutions is a vital point of difference. And in the end, we had great debates, but that's why we came on board, because precisely we could see a balance here, which I think is the right balance. We should be working with other of the big digital companies to ensure that in a civilization level, we find the right balance between this huge commercial dynamism and the lasting institutions and the new institutions, to actually help new institutions come into being. Things that get born now, your museum and others, should still be here in 50 years' time, 200 years' time. And that, getting good at that, seems to me absolutely vital. And if those institutions have meaning, have passion, have purpose, then they will thrive and survive in this age. Mm-hmm. Google is part of the discovery value chain along with dozens of other sources of research, and what, in terms of the primary knowledge mission of the library, we often say to people, yeah, learn how to use the search engines, and there are other great search engines as well, but also think about other kinds of research, test them, and that's what places like this are good at. And our mission, I guess, is to constantly democratize research at the very, very highest level, to create a healthily skeptical, questioning population, whatever your background, so that everyone gets good both at using the tools of the digital age, but knowing how to question them and challenge them as well.
Suhail sort of referred to the fact that, because they only worked with not-for-profits and there was no profit motive in this particular part of it, that money, as long as you keep money out of it, it's all kosher. Kishwar, how important is money in making or preserving or creating what is obviously very valuable institutions of culture?
Oh, I cannot begin to emphasize. Okay, now this is where I pull out my little bag and go around, asking for donations. But I
zoom
cannot.
Out and you really give us the.
It is really important, and I have to say that was, had we not got the donations from people, I mean, obviously, there was no way that we could have set up the museum, organized it, run and maintained it till today. We have now, from, as I said, 2.5 years ago, there was nothing. Today, we have something like 30 employees working with us, curators working with us, and they're all paid. I mean, they may not be paid fantastically, but they are being paid. And that, I think, is a very important part of the preservation of culture, is that people, whilst Google, of course, has tons of money, and we love partnering with Google and the British Library. But the point is that if, in order to set up new museums and new cultural institutions without which actually this world would not be able to move forward, because there are tons and tons of things. I have to say this, that when you do look at, and I hope people will be able to look at the Partition Museum online, there is nothing to supplant the experience of actually going into that museum, reading those stories, looking, as I absolutely agree with you, there is the physicality of it, which is so important. And all of this costs a lot of money. And that's where I do believe that all of us should begin to think, even in terms of India, when you do send your donations to India, and I know a lot of you support a lot of good causes there. You do support the, things which will educate the girl child and so on, which I think is all very good. I do the same. But I do want you to think also about art and culture, not through just wonderful institutions like, yes, we all need to now begin to think, because India has a vast heritage. And if all of you begin to contribute even small amounts, believe me, a lot can happen. And many more foundations such as yours, the Aga Khan Foundation, which is doing excellent work, would come up. And it's essential. Otherwise, we're going to lose a lot. The world will be a poorer place. And we all can't visit the British Museum every time we want a bit of Indian culture.
Matt, coming back to you, across history, every conquering general has rewritten the telling of their story in a way that suits them or is a paean to them or whatever. And this is true even today between Trump's new America and Modi's new India, and it continues. So that's part of evolving history. And yet in the Aga Khan Foundation, and especially in the cultural space, one is seeing that you all have really taken that much larger view, where you haven't looked at in any way dividing or being divisive or reinterpreting in any way, but you've taken the larger view that this is for all of mankind. Can you tell us a little bit again about why is it important, especially in today's very fast evolving sort of communication world, why is it so important to preserve culture in its very basic form?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's important to say that for us, wherever we work with everyone, of all faiths, all backgrounds, every caste. In India, for example, 50% of the people we work with are tribal. About 25% are scheduled caste or Dalits, and roughly 20% or so are Muslims. So that fundamental principle runs through everything that we do, because we think that's the only way that we can have legitimacy, frankly. If we were only promoting a sort of very narrow particular view, well, then you get into this whole controversy of, well, what line are you pushing, et cetera. We feel very strongly in the notion of comparative knowledge. So if you look at the Aga Khan Center, which will open a couple of blocks from here, we'll open it in a couple of weeks and then open to the public in September. It will house 3 institutions: the Aga Khan Foundation, the Aga Khan University's Institute for the Study of Muslim Civilizations, emphasis on plural there, and then the Institute for Ismaili Studies. And I think what's very interesting about them all is that that notion of plurality is built into all of them. So even the Institute for Ismaili Study is an institute for the study of Ismailisms. How has their religion been practiced? What have the thoughts been in different countries, in different contexts? Because the view is that actually there is not sort of one tradition for all time. I'm not talking about the Ismaili tradition, I'm talking about knowledge, right? All history is a history of the present. We all come to history wanting to learn different things and do different things. One of the important things about history is that it's a place for us to imagine alternative presents and alternative futures. And what we want to do is create platforms for doing that. That's why, frankly, that's why we love the Jaipur Literature Festival. I mean, the excitement I got the first time I came to Jaipur around all of these people excited about ideas and about debate and about literature, I thought was wonderful. That's why we want to associate with you. That's why we're delighted to associate with British Library and Google and others. And what we want to do through our institutions is create places that will do that, and I think institutions, as Rolly says, that will do that for the long term. We want to be a platform for discussion and debate. Because, look, fake news has always existed. But what's very, very important is that you have spaces where we can contest fake news, right? And that we can come up with shared values for collective interpretation. And without institutions like the British Library and others, that becomes much more difficult.
Suhair, don't look alarmed, I promise you. You know, what you all have done, I think, has really been precious, because you have given an opportunity to deep dive in what is actually, you know, you want to know something, you Google. But in this particular, in the Google Cultural Lab, you can go deep dive and, you know, get to the bottom of all of world collective history. A little bit of crystal glazing. How do you see this progressing into the future? And how do you see this in the new technology? You know, at the end of the day, as all of us know, you know, the third industrial revolution is very much behind us, and the fourth revolution that stares in our face is really about ideas and innovation meeting design and technology. And in that space, I think people involved in the arts community, in the larger creative industry sector, are well poised to find incredible new opportunity. But I doubt that the world, and certainly governments, don't think of that yet, but maybe they'll wake up to it at some point of time. But do a little crystal gazing and tell us, how do you see this evolving, and what's the next once you've finished all, you know, 550,000 museums and documenting them?
I mean, so that's the biggest thing. So we think of things, and I've been in technology for a long time, so we look at data and then we look at technology. And so in terms of the number of cultural institutions in the world, it's unlimited. We will never document all of them, and there will always be new amazing institutions that are coming up and growing and representing peoples and cultures in unique ways. So our goal will always be, how far can we spread? We call it moonshot thinking, right? How far can you push the idea of getting everyone online and letting the world's cultural information sit together? But in terms of actual technologies, we're obviously now on our phones. And I think we've been working a lot now at integrating more and more forms of machine learning to make it a funner, more playful, serendipitous experience. But ironically also, we're looking at physical places. So bringing things back on site. To Rolly's point, having something tangible that's magical in a place where people can actually feel it, but has the magic of technology with it. We did a small installation with the British Library last year, their Harry Potter exhibition. We have a few other sites around the world now where we're trying to see how we can navigate the balance between the physical and the technological. We're looking a lot more at virtual reality and, of course, at the idea of augmented reality, which is really when your phone and yourself kind of are interacting in a way that is one step beyond what you're just engaging with. So you can bring the entire site of Palmyra in Syria, for example, into your phone and look at it at various points of destruction, walk around it using your phone, expand it. It might have seemed crazy a few years ago because your phone is so tiny, but now we see the world in our phones, and that really shifts the way our perception is, and that's going to be happening a lot more. There's a lot more freedom for developers to create augmented reality experiences. I was just at the Egyptian Museum in Cairo, and they had, you know, sort of a scrap of paper on the wall and an AR experience built around it. And so you can see that there's young kids who are coming up and thinking about how they can bring their culture through technology to people. And then I think kind of looking further into the long term, there is going to be a lot of more innovations. We have a lab in Paris where we work with creative coders who are technologists who think about art, and they work with artists, they work with museums, and they're constantly pushing through what we call experiments to see what might work, what people might engage with. Most of these are never published. We don't talk about many of them, but about 6 months ago, we published a huge cache of them online, where we're using things like visual recognition to discover kind of which photographs at the MoMA were taken, which year, and which exhibition by comparing these photographs to actual artworks in the collection of the MoMA. Things that we would never have come up with, but that museums are pushing us to do. And these are now slowly coming online. So this is evolving, but I think that things that are more immersive are going to become much more part of how technology accesses collections and museums. But it will always need the partnership of these experts. And I'm not just saying it because we work with them. At the end of the day, you can post 100 pictures of paintings online, and if you don't have the story of the artist and what he painted and what he used, they're almost meaningless.
Well, the story is super important, and I have a million questions still to ask, including asking Rolly what's going to happen if there was a nuclear bomb blast here, or if there was Brexit. But maybe we leave that for a later time. And let's open the questions out to the House, and the whole series of them. So let's start with theirs, as the mic is closest, and then, yeah.
Hi, myself Sangeeta. This is not a question, it's a kind of a comment.
But keep it short. If it's
yes.
a comment, please.
No, it's
only,
not a question. I just wanted to add, like what you said, it's not possible for all Indians to come to British Library or British Museum to access the, of course, resources. So it's actually happening, that exchanging, because I am at British Library as a Rutherford Fellow. So we are like exchanging the data. I work for American Institute of Indian Studies in Delhi. So it's an exchange of data, like especially the musical heritage, which are not in India. We are not exchanging with British Library. So it's a like effort, yeah, just to add it.
Well, you must meet Somjit, whose big exhibition of musical instruments is coming to London next year. But I'll first there and then Tripti.
Right. First of all, I'd like to congratulate Sanjoy on his long hair. I also subscribe to the theory we cannot leave it all to the girls.
Absolutely, absolutely.
I have a question for Suhair. What's the balance in the languages you deal with within your enterprise? That's my question. Thank you.
So we work with many languages, and we don't work with all languages, and that is something that's become a bigger issue in the last few years. We have been doing a lot more work in the Middle East, and we still don't have the right to left text. And so that's the last cache of language that we still don't have on our platform, and we're working very actively towards it. But most of our international projects are launched in at least 10 languages at a time. We actually, for the first time, we did Hindi actually with the British Library, because in India, most people are fine with English, but we want to make this accessible, and it's growing. But it is still not comprehensive, and that's something that we realize is actually sort of a point of challenge.
But you do know that Sheikh Al Sawadi in UAE, who's translated now 200 books into Arabic, has developed the technology to do left to right.
Well,
and we'll put you in touch at some point.
Thank you, yeah. I mean, I think it's, on Google, of course, you can search for Arabic. It is more this platform and how it works, and to make sure that all of these amazing experiments and technologies are accessible. You should see
some of what he's done, including the new program, and Ibn Battuta, which is his great new passion project, and hopefully. Tripti, I think, and then coming back to I'll come back to the back in a second.
To you, sir, because you said, and your gentleman from, he also said that you want it to be more accessible and with the digitalization and all that. But there's another side, because I work a lot on the intangible heritage and living traditions. So when you say sites of memory, for me the basic site is also the book. And having done a book on India's elephants, a cultural legacy, very recently, my trouble is this. When I do a book like this, I want to source from British Library as well. Perhaps getting an image from you on a digital format, for a book which doesn't really mean a commercial book, you have more charges levied to it than my book costs. Then how do I create a site for living memory through book, which can also add to your site here?
Yeah. So good question, and I think it is, I think we are on a journey because we have issues of copyright and protection and the costs and so on. But I think all institutions like ours, to be honest, are evolving as rapidly as we can to understand the demand that is rightly created by the digital age. So may I take that as simply sensible feedback, because I think it is a journey we are on. We want to help Knowledge of all kind. We want to help people write books in terms of
and set up museums. we
but I
face
think, I mean, you raise also the point about living heritage, and I was also going to say, I think we haven't talked very much today about what we collect for the future, because there are books, of course, there are images, manuscripts, and so on. We're also very passionate about voices and oral history, and I was just thinking as you were talking about your museum, how vital it is also to capture different kinds of memory in our age. We collect the web now, because that may actually, in 50 years' time, be the true record that people publishing and researching want to capture. So yes to those images, but also we're simultaneously trying to think ahead, because we're also, as you know, the National Sound Archive here. We build oral histories because these are not published in the traditional sense. We endeavor to share those. So I mean, in a way, that's another shared challenge for us as a research community. Thank you.
Back there. I'm going to take both the questions and then we'll come to the answers. So you and then the gentleman.
Hello. First of all, thank you very much for the talk. It was fantastic. I've question for Suhair. How far are we from the point that Google itself is capable of creating narratives, new patterns, new ways of thinking?
And question in front.
Thank you very much. Taking up Kishwa's point about funding by governments for cultural institutions, I think tradition in this country has mainly been that statues and museums and other cultural sites of memory have been determined by civil society, by the public. In Germany, my understanding is a different model. Both the federal units and the central government have whole departments devoted to deciding who should have a statue or what institution should be commemorated. Is that a model that commends itself to any of the panel?
So do you want to take that question about...
Yeah, so I think your question was around the idea of machine learning and how sort of these technologies are evolving. There's many examples now of machine learning being able to recreate, basic poetry or artworks or even music. And those are examples that are usually not as sophisticated as you would expect them to be, but that's changing very quickly. I don't think anyone is talking about these technologies being able to think in the way we think or act in the way that we act, but they're certainly being able to take information from things that humans have written and said, through video or sound or through text over time, and to try to create intelligent forms of recreating them in new ways. But that is really very early and very ongoing, and I'm seeing the same stuff that you're seeing.
I don't know whether you know, but in the UN there's now a robot which we hope to invite to the Jaipur Literature Festival, who is a literature robot. I mean, you can ask them, I asked the robot a question like this about India, Pakistan, or China, or whatever, and the robot will give you an answer, of course, in a particular way. So maybe that's a possible way of the future of the narrative. Well, I'm not sure about that.
Well, artificial intelligence. Yeah, funding. What you said is correct. I think the sensible thing would be for people to come together, as happens here in the UK, and to put their funds and set up institutions and so on. But in a country like India, where the disparities are so great of income, this would be always the responsibility of those. Maybe Meghnad will correct me, 1% or 2% of the really well-to-do, who would be constantly funding all these things, because unfortunately the middle class does not consider itself as being sort of wealthy enough at any stage or point to support these kind of things. And if they have money, they'd rather give it to temples, frankly. So I think there is a problem there. There needs to be much more awareness. The government therefore needs to enter into some sort of a public-private partnership, where if they provide, as I said, the spaces, as they've done for us, then we could possibly step forward and raise that money, that donation, and then get this institution up and running. That would give it some amount of independence. Otherwise, if it's only being decided by the government departments that this is good and that is bad, then I'm afraid you're going to get, according to the government of your choice.
But that is the situation right now. There are a number of, bureaucrats who sit in small little rooms renaming streets and redeciding which very ugly sculpture is going to be commissioned by and put up in every street corner. So that is the fact. There are two questions, and then I wanted to come back to Rolly, yes, and one of the back there. If we can get both the questions together, and then we'll come back to the answers.
Cool. One of my favorite museums in the entire world is in Mexico City. It's called the Museum of Memory and Tolerance. Yes. Which initially was billed as a Holocaust and Genocide Museum, but then they've kind of rebranded it and renamed it as Memory and Tolerance. And when you go through it, the experience is, of course, of sadness and shock and horror, because you just see the dark side of human nature and human history. But you come out of it with a very positive light, with hope for the future. Do you think it's important for museums like the Partition Museum, which are documenting something that is obviously a very sad aspect of human history, but should people come out of it with hope? And has your museum made a conscious effort to work in that way?
Conscious effort to hope. Just hold the answer.
By chance, it's connected to the previous question. The question is that the speakers on the...
Closer to your...
The underlying assumption by all the speakers on the platform seems to be that pluralism is good for society and good for integration and understanding, as the previous questioner seemed to imply. Recent history suggests otherwise. So the question is, does it promote better understanding and integration? Because we know of examples of the guards at concentration camps listening to Beethoven and Mozart and then going on to exterminate. So there's a skepticism, therefore, in the
So does pluralism actually promote understanding and harmony? Did you want to, and one last question, and I'm going to...
Mine is a very basic question. As technology is developing, how are we archiving this? I know that as sound archives are becoming more and more inaccessible as we lose the technology that was initially used to archive these. Is that going to happen with our digital technology as well in the future? I don't know if anybody's been thinking about it.
Archiving, pluralism versus understanding, and the first bit which you want to go.
So should I just answer that, and maybe others can take on the rest? Yes, as I said earlier, we have 14 galleries spread over 17,000 square feet, very close to the Golden Temple, very close to Jallianwala Bagh. The museum is in Town Hall. So the fact that we are trying to do, what we are trying to do out there is exactly what you said. We are taking people through the experience. We tell actually the history of what was happening in India. We take it back about 100 years. We start around 1847, 57. We start around that, give a brief history of what was going on, go through the freedom struggle, because both independence and partition were actually moving on parallel tracks, but side by side. And then the story of partition takes over at a particular point. But the last gallery is the Gallery of Hope. As I said, so people actually come there, the music changes, the tone. We have soundscapes throughout where we've used recorded music of that time, and so on. So the last gallery is called the Gallery of Hope, and it documents precisely the stories of resilience, of communities helping each other, of how people go back, and the warmth and love they get from people despite the fact that their parents left that particular house or whatever. So when they come out, they're in a different frame of mind. It's much more positive. We have hundreds of school children coming to that museum who actually have given us the greatest endorsement I can ever hope for.
To hear about technology very quickly.
Yeah, me and I think Rolly can speak about this too. So there's a lot of work being done. I mean, one of the founders of the internet is Vincent Cerf, and he is very worried about the idea of the digital dark age. So you can Google that. And there's a lot of work being done by technology institutions, by cultural institutions to think about what it means to have had now, a few decades of digital information and how it's being archived, if at all. Things like obviously communication, but just, things like what you had on a floppy disk. What happens to that? So there's work ongoing, but it's very much, because it's in our time, it's a work in progress.
Do you want to talk about tolerance? And plurality?
Well, what Matt, what does Matt come in?
Well, I mean, one thing, I just think the example that was used is odd. I think, Beethoven and Nazi guards would be an example of how culture is used to actually reinforce notions of cultural superiority and exclusion, not pluralism. But I think that underlying it, maybe your question is that in a context where multiple traditions come together, that this can produce friction. And the whole point around our work on pluralism is to make people comfortable with that difference and to have them engage in that difference. Now, sometimes that is going to be contested. It's not always going to be comfortable and easy. But the point being is that we have to create places where people can have those conversations. And I think, so that's where I would say where our emphasis is on pluralism is around that engagement and promoting places where you can have that engagement. I don't think it's a panacea, and I think we do have to acknowledge that sometimes these are painful processes. Yeah.
Just to add to that, at the end of the day, we know that in many societies now and in the past, regressive regimes or regimes again and again have used culture and education to be able to create a didactic conversation and movement, and have perpetrated the most incredible of horrors using this collection of whether it's religion or culture or education, etc. And it is a big issue, and it will continue to be a big issue. And I'm going to end by, before I'm going to ask Rolly to tell us a little bit about Hope and Magna Carta, I'm going to just leave with you one of the exhibitions that I saw that completely, the visual imagery just still stays with me. It's something called Exhibit B, and I don't know whether any of you in the room ever saw it. It was banned from opening in London at the Barbican. It opened in Edinburgh some years ago. And basically what it had is it's told the story of repression and regression by these great dominant powers of the Dutch and the Belgians and the British, etc., in Africa and across Africa. But what they did was they used live people to tell those stories. So you went in there, and you went in there in groups of 5 or 6, and you walked around seeing what people did to other people in the name of slavery and rule and control and cultural domination. It was devastating, absolutely devastating. So we need to be very aware of how culture and education and knowledge is being used. And Rolly, back to you. Last few words, sorry, 2 minutes, just Magna Carta, what a story of hope. It's a project that you sort of championed, brought all the Magna Cartas together, showed to the world that here it was, this simple document that was put together so many years ago became the foundation of the rule of law in society.
We did. This was 3 years ago, the 800th anniversary of Magna Carta. Sandra, I'm going to make that point, though, maybe a little more complex in response to some of the questions, just to conclude. I think we have talked about telling stories, and I certainly feel as a library, we are here to generally to enable stories, empower everybody to find out what they can of the facts, never to censor the record, always to offer that next bit of knowledge that enriches their story, the next person's stories. And some of them are stories of hope, some of them are stories of the opposite, and that's fine, that's as it should be. So in that sense, I think we proudly feel it is a story of openness for everyone to do that, but we're not here to be didactic. We do then sometimes tell stories of our own. We put on exhibitions. Magna Carta was one of them, absolutely. You can see it now. These are very contested, difficult histories. Magna Carta was a story of absolute division and contest, disagreement, still going. We said when we did the Magna Carta exhibition, this is actually unfinished business, how you balance power in a state, and it's ongoing. We wanted to make that point rather than just celebrate. There are things to celebrate, but it's more than that. If you go into the library now, we're tackling 2 of the toughest, most difficult tales UK's been associated with James Cook's voyages, connecting and colliding and transforming cultures for good and ill. The Windrush exhibition, an anniversary exhibition that turned out to be timely, to put it mildly, and absolutely on what still turns out to be a fault line in this culture. And that's fine, because the exhibitions we try and mount attempt to not simplify, but like some of the great writers you have here, to tell the story as honestly as our curators can now and stimulate others to tell their stories. That's our hope, is to keep the stories coming.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Matt. Thank you, Suhair. Thank you.
Thank you, Sandra. Well done.
Thank you, Sandra.